Far beyond the orbit of Neptune, where sunlight grew thin and the stars burned cold and sharp, a fleet of alien warships moved through the dark like a slow tide of metal. There were 300 ships in that fleet, each one larger than any building humans had ever built on Earth. They belonged to the Kaltari Dominion, an empire that had swallowed 40 worlds in the last 200 years. The Kaltari did not ask permission before they took a planet. They simply came, and they took, and the people who lived there either bowed or died. The Kaltari had been watching Earth for almost 60 years. Old radio signals, television broadcasts, and stray bursts of data had drifted out from Earth into space, spreading slowly in every direction, like ripples in a pond. The Kaltari had caught some of these signals decades ago, far out at the edge of their territory, and they had studied them, the way a butcher studies an animal before slaughter. They saw wars fought with simple guns and metal tanks. They saw arguments on television about politics and money. They saw a species that fought each other over small pieces of land and small differences of belief. To the Kaltari, humans looked weak, foolish, and easy to conquer. Grand Marshal Vrixthalor stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Devourer of Stars, and looked at the images the ship's scanners had built of the blue planet ahead. He was a tall being, taller than any human, with gray skin like old stone, and eyes that glowed faintly amber in low light. He had conquered 6 worlds in his long career, and Earth would be his 7th. He did not expect much resistance. "Send the signal to the rest of the fleet," Vrix said to his second-in-command, a smaller Kaltari named Sarek. "Tell them we begin the final approach in 6 hours. By this time tomorrow, this system will belong to the Dominion." Sarek bowed his head slightly. "Yes, Grand Marshal. Our scans of the planet show old radio and television signals, weapons based on chemical explosions, and no signs of true space combat vessels beyond a handful of small stations and probes. This will be an easy conquest." Vrix allowed himself a small, cold smile. "Good. I grow tired of hard conquests. Let this one be simple." But what the Kaltari did not know, what their scans and their old signals could never have told them, was that Earth had changed. 60 years is a very long time for a species that learns quickly, and humans had always been very good at learning quickly, especially when they were afraid. The truth had started decades earlier, in a quiet room deep under a mountain in Colorado, in the United States. A group of scientists working on a deep space telescope had picked up something strange in the data. It was not a normal signal. It was structured, patterned, and clearly artificial. After months of study, they understood what they had found. It was a fragment of an alien transmission, likely never meant for human eyes, that spoke of an empire called the Kaltari Dominion, and a plan to expand into new star systems, including one that matched the coordinates of Earth's own solar system. At first, the government did not believe it. Scientists argued, politicians doubted, but the evidence kept growing. More signals were found, more patterns emerged. Slowly, quietly, without any public announcement, world governments began to talk to each other in secret. They realized that if this threat was real, humanity had perhaps 50 or 60 years before an alien fleet arrived at Earth. That was not a long time to prepare for an invasion from beyond the stars. A secret organization was formed, made up of scientists, engineers, generals, and leaders from every major nation on Earth. They called it Project Vigil. Its only purpose was to prepare humanity for a war that most of the world's population did not even know was coming. Public space programs continued as always, sending rockets to the moon and to Mars, building space stations, launching satellites. But behind all of that, in secret shipyards built on the far side of the moon, in hollowed-out asteroids, and in stations hidden deep within the asteroid belt, humanity built something else. A fleet, a weapon, a shield for their world. It was not easy. It took generations. Entire lives were spent by engineers and workers who would die of old age before the invasion ever came, knowing only that they were building for a war their grandchildren might have to fight. Nations that had once been rivals worked side by side because they all understood the same simple truth. If the aliens came and Earth was not ready, none of the old arguments between nations would matter anymore. There would be no more nations, only conquered people or dead ones. By the time the Kaltari fleet finally entered the outer edge of the solar system, humanity had built more than just a handful of small stations. Hidden in the black between the planets was the Sol Defense Fleet, 412 warships built from materials mined from asteroids and moons, armed with weapons developed from decades of secret research. The public did not know these ships existed. Most governments' own citizens did not know. Only a small circle of leaders, engineers, and the men and women who served aboard those ships knew the truth. Earth was not defenseless. Earth had been waiting. Admiral James Voss stood on the bridge of the human flagship, a vessel named the Endurance, and watched the same alien fleet that Vrix Thalor was watching, except from the other direction. The Endurance and the rest of the Sol Defense Fleet were hidden among the icy rocks of the Kuiper Belt, far beyond Neptune, using stealth technology that made them nearly invisible to Kaltari sensors. Voss was a calm man in his 50s, with gray hair and steady eyes. He had trained for this moment for almost 30 years, ever since he had first been recruited into Project Vigil as a young officer. "Report," Voss said quietly to his tactical officer, a woman named Captain Sarah Chen. "They're right where our long-range sensors predicted, Admiral," Chen said. 300 ships, moving at moderate speed. No sign they've detected us. Their formation is loose. They're not expecting a fight." Voss nodded slowly. "Good. Let them keep thinking that." Behind him, on the wide view screen, the image of the alien fleet glowed faintly against the black of space. 300 warships. Compared to humanity's 412, the Kaltari were outnumbered, but their ships were larger, and Voss knew from decades of secret research that Kaltari weapons technology was, in some areas, more advanced than humanity's own. This would not be an easy fight, but it would not be the slaughter the Kaltari expected either. "All ships, maintain silent running," Voss ordered. "No power beyond life support and passive sensors. Let them come closer. We want them well inside our range before they know we're here." The order rippled outward through the fleet, ship to ship, carried by tight, encrypted laser communication instead of radio, so that no stray signal would give away their position. Across 400 ships, tens of thousands of men and women sat quietly at their stations, watching the alien fleet grow larger on their screens, waiting for the order that would begin the greatest battle in human history. Among them was a young pilot named Lieutenant Marcus Webb, aboard a strike fighter called the Falcon 7. Marcus was only 26 years old, born and raised on a research colony on the far side of the moon, one of the many hidden settlements built by Project Vigil over the decades. He had never lived on Earth itself. He had trained his whole life for this single moment, flying simulated battles against imagined alien fleets in the massive underground training facilities beneath the lunar surface. Now the moment had finally come, and he felt his hands sweating inside his flight gloves. "You nervous?" asked his wingman, a woman named Lieutenant Priya Anand, over the short-range comm. "A little," Marcus admitted. "My whole life, they told us this day was coming. Now it's here, and it still feels unreal." "Yeah," Priya said. "Feels like the whole world is holding its breath, except the world doesn't even know it's holding its breath." That was the strange truth of it. Somewhere behind them, past the orbit of Mars, past the asteroid belt, past Jupiter and Saturn and Uranus, Earth spun on, as it always had. Billions of people went about their daily lives, going to work, eating dinner, watching television, completely unaware that far out in the dark, a battle was about to begin that would decide whether their species survived or was enslaved. Only a small number of leaders on Earth knew what was happening this very hour. Project Vigil had planned it that way from the start. There was no point causing panic among billions of people who could do nothing to help. Better to let the fleet fight in silence and tell the world afterward, once the outcome was known. On the bridge of the Devourer of Stars, Grand Marshal Vrix Thalor received a report from his sensor officer that made him pause. "Grand Marshal, we are picking up faint gravitational disturbances near several of the larger asteroids in this region," the officer said. "The readings are inconsistent with natural debris." Vrix frowned slightly. "Explain." "I cannot fully explain it, Grand Marshal. The readings could be the beginning of small moonlets forming, or mineral deposits with unusual density, or they could be something else. Ship hulls, perhaps, though our scans show no vessels." Vrix considered this for a moment, then waved a hand dismissively. "This system is young, and full of rocky debris. It is not surprising there would be strange gravitational readings. Do not waste further time on it. Continue our approach." It was a small moment, barely noticed, but it would matter enormously in the hours to come. Vrix Thalor, confident from 6 easy conquests, chose not to worry about a strange reading that his instincts, if he had trusted them more, might have told him to fear. Aboard the Endurance, Admiral Voss watched a similar report come across his own screen, this one showing that a Kaltari sensor sweep had briefly detected something before apparently dismissing it. "They caught a flicker of us," Chen said. "But it looks like they're writing it off as debris." "Let's hope they keep writing it off," Voss said. "How much longer until they're inside optimal engagement range?" "At their current speed, approximately 4 hours, Admiral." Voss nodded and turned to look out at the vast fleet spread around his own ship, thousands of vessels of every size, from massive capital ships built from hollowed-out asteroids to small, swift strike fighters like the one Marcus Webb was flying. He thought of all the people who had built this fleet and never lived to see it used. His own father had been one of the very first engineers recruited into Project Vigil, back when it was barely more than a handful of frightened scientists in an underground room. His father had died 15 years ago, an old man, having spent his entire adult life designing ship hulls for a war he was told, again and again, might not come for another generation. He had believed in it anyway. He had built anyway. "This is for you, Dad," Voss murmured quietly, too soft for anyone else on the bridge to hear. 4 hours passed slowly, the way hours always do when soldiers wait for a battle they know is coming. On the Falcon 7, Marcus Webb checked his weapons systems for perhaps the 10th time, even though he knew everything was in perfect order. Beside him, Priya hummed a quiet tune to herself, an old song her grandmother used to sing, something to keep her hands from shaking. On the bridge of the Devourer of Stars, Grand Marshal Vrix Thalor addressed his fleet through a wide broadcast, his voice carrying to every Kaltari ship in the formation. "Warriors of the Dominion," he said, his amber eyes glowing with pride, "we approach a new world. Its people are primitive, weak, and unprepared. Today, we add a 7th world to the glory of the Dominion. There will be little resistance. Take your positions, and prepare to descend upon their planet." Glory to the Dominion. Across 300 ships, Kaltari warriors roared in response, a sound of confidence and pride that echoed through the halls of their fleet. They believed, completely and without doubt, that Earth would fall easily beneath them, just as 6 other worlds had fallen before it. They did not know that the humans were watching them the entire time, patient and silent, hidden among the ice and rock of the outer solar system, waiting for the exact right moment to strike. Aboard the Endurance, Admiral Voss received the final confirmation from his sensor officers. The Kaltari fleet had entered the outer edge of the engagement zone, the precise point in space where the Sol Defense Fleet's weapons could reach them with full effect, while the Kaltari's own sensors remained blind to the human ships hidden among the asteroids. Voss took a slow breath. 30 years of preparation, decades of secret work, by thousands of scientists and engineers and soldiers, all came down to this single moment. He thought once more of his father, and of all the others who had given their lives to build this fleet, without ever knowing if it would be needed, or if it would be enough. "All ships," Voss said, his voice steady and clear, carried by laser communication to every vessel in the fleet. "This is Admiral Voss. The enemy fleet has entered our engagement zone. They believe we do not exist. They believe Earth is helpless. They are wrong." He paused, looking once more at the image of the alien fleet drifting closer, 300 ships full of confidence, unaware of the storm about to break upon them. "Humanity has been waiting a long time for this day," Voss said. "We built this fleet in secret, in silence, so that when this moment came, we would not be caught helpless, like every other world these invaders have conquered. Today, we prove that Earth is not an easy prize. Today, we show them what it means to underestimate humanity." He raised his hand, and on ships across the fleet, thousands of men and women placed their fingers on the controls of the weapons and engines they had trained their whole lives to use. "All ships," Voss said, "engage." And in the black silence of space, where no one on Earth could see it happening, the first shots of humanity's war for survival were fired. The first human weapons fired in complete silence, because sound cannot travel through the empty vacuum of space. But on the bridge of the Devourer of Stars, Grand Marshal Vrix Thalor felt the impact anyway, a sudden shudder that ran through the deck plating beneath his feet, as something struck his ship's shields hard enough to make the lights flicker. "Report!" Vrick shouted, gripping the edge of his command chair. "Grand Marshal, we are under attack." His sensor officer cried out, his voice cracking with shock. Weapons fire, coming from multiple directions among the asteroid field, shields at 82% and falling. For a moment, Vrix Thalor simply stared at his screen, unable to process what he was seeing. Ships, hundreds of them. Vessels that had not existed on his scans a moment ago were suddenly visible, decloaking from hidden positions among the asteroids, moons, and empty dark of the Kuiper Belt. They surrounded his fleet on every side, and they were firing. "That is impossible," Vrix said quietly. "Our scans showed nothing. No fleet, no shipyards, nothing." "They must have been using some form of stealth technology we do not understand, Grand Marshal," Sarek said, his voice tight with alarm as he worked frantically at his console. "Their weapons fire is precise. They knew exactly where to aim before decloaking. This was not a lucky ambush. This was planned. Around the Devourer of Stars." The rest of the Kaltari fleet scrambled to respond, ships turning and raising their shields, weapons systems powering up as fast as their crews could manage. But the Kaltari had entered this system, expecting an easy conquest of a primitive world, not a coordinated ambush by a hidden fleet nearly as large as their own. Their formation, loose and confident only minutes before, was now caught in disarray, ships scattered and vulnerable, as human vessels struck from every angle. Aboard the Falcon 7. Lieutenant Marcus Webb pushed his fighter hard through the chaos of the opening battle, weaving between debris and enemy fire, with the skill of a pilot who had trained for this exact moment his entire life. Ahead of him, a Kaltari escort ship, smaller than the massive capital ships, but still far larger than his own fighter, turned its weapons toward him. "Priya, on your left," Marcus called out over the comm, watching as an enemy fighter, sleek and dark, banked hard to line up a shot on his wingman's ship. "I see it," Priya replied, twisting her fighter into a tight roll that sent the enemy shot sailing past her hull by mere meters. She fired back, her fighter's twin cannons sending a stream of energy bolts into the Kaltari fighter's side. The alien ship's shields flared bright blue as they absorbed the hit, but did not break. "Their shields are tougher than the simulations predicted," Marcus said, gritting his teeth. "Then we hit them twice as hard," Priya answered, and dove back into the fight. All across the battlefield, similar scenes played out. Human fighters, faster and more maneuverable than their Kaltari counterparts but with weaker individual weapons, worked in coordinated pairs and squadrons, exactly as they had trained for decades in the simulators beneath the moon's surface. Where a single human fighter might struggle against a Kaltari escort ship, 2 or 3 working together, striking from different angles, could overwhelm its shields and tear through its hull. On the Endurance. Admiral Voss watched the battle unfold across a massive holographic display that showed the positions of every ship in both fleets, updated in real time by the combined sensor data of the entire Sol Defense Fleet. "Their formation is breaking apart faster than we hoped," Captain Chen reported, her fingers moving quickly across her console. "They weren't ready for a fight of this scale. Their commanders are struggling to coordinate a response." "Good," Voss said, "but don't get comfortable. They're a Dominion fleet. They've conquered 6 other worlds. They'll adapt." He was right to be cautious. Even as he spoke, the Kaltari fleet, though caught off guard, began to show why it had conquered so many worlds before. Grand Marshal Vrix Thalor, despite his shock, was not a fool, and he did not panic for long. "All ships, form the Serpent Formation," Vrix ordered, his voice sharp and commanding once more. "Capital ships to the center, escorts to the outer ring. Concentrate fire on the nearest human vessels, and punch a hole through their line." The order spread through the Kaltari fleet, and slowly, despite the chaos, their ships began to organize themselves into a tighter, more defensible formation. The Kaltari were an old empire, experienced in war, and even caught by surprise. Their training held. Ships that had been scattered began to regroup, their heavier capital vessels moving to the center of the formation, while smaller, faster escorts screened the outside, ready to intercept incoming human fighters. "Admiral, their formation is stabilizing," Chen reported, a note of concern in her voice. "They're concentrating fire on the..." Hammond. The day they invaded. Kestrel. Voss looked at the display and saw the two human cruisers she meant, both taking heavy fire from a cluster of Kaltari capital ships that had turned to focus on them. Redirect the 4th and 6th squadrons to support them, Voss ordered, and get me a channel to Captain Reyes on the Hammond. A moment later, the voice of Captain Elena Reyes came through the comm, tense but steady. Admiral, we're taking heavy damage. Shields down to 40%. We can hold, but not much longer without support. Support is coming, Captain. Hold your position and keep firing. Don't let them break through your line. Understood, Admiral. Hammond out. Aboard the Hammond. Reyes gripped the arms of her chair as another volley of enemy fire slammed into her ship's shields, the whole vessel shuddering with the impact. Sparks flew from a console near the back of the bridge, and a young ensign scrambled to put out a small fire that had started in the wiring beneath it. Return fire. Concentrate on the lead capital ship, Reyes ordered. If we can knock out its weapons array, it'll take the pressure off us. The Hammond. Gunners, trained for exactly this kind of precision strike, adjusted their aim and sent a focused barrage of fire toward the forward weapons array of the nearest Kaltari capital ship. The alien vessel's shields flared and buckled under the concentrated assault, and after several long seconds, its weapons array finally went dark, the ship's return fire slowing as its systems struggled to compensate. Direct hit. Their weapons are offline. The Hammond's tactical officer called out. Good work, Reyes said, allowing herself a brief moment of relief before another impact rocked the ship. Now let's finish the job before they bring their weapons back online. Elsewhere in the battle, the human fleet's larger strategy began to show itself. Unlike the Kaltari, who fought with individual bravery and raw power, the humans had spent decades designing their tactics around coordination and teamwork, understanding that they could not match the Kaltari ship for ship, but could overwhelm them through smarter, more flexible formations. Admiral Voss watched as smaller human vessels, faster and more numerous than the Kaltari's own escorts, began to slip past the outer ring of the alien formation, using the confusion of the battle to find gaps in the enemy's defenses. Once inside the ring, they turned their weapons on the vulnerable underside of the Kaltari capital ships, striking at systems that were normally protected by the outer escorts. They're getting through, Sarek reported to Grand Marshal Vrix, alarm clear in his voice. Several human vessels have broken past our escort screen and are attacking our capital ships directly. Vrix the Lore's amber eyes narrowed as he studied the tactical display before him. He had fought many battles in his long career, but he had never faced an enemy that fought quite like this, with such coordination between small, fast ships and larger vessels, striking at weak points with almost mechanical precision. Pull the escort ring tighter, Vrix ordered. Do not let any more of their small ships through, and bring the Devourer of Stars forward. If they want to test the Dominion's strength, let them test it against my own flagship. The Devourer of Stars began to move forward through the Kaltari formation, its massive weapons batteries charging with visible energy that lit up the space around it in a dim, threatening glow. It was, by far, the largest and most powerful ship in either fleet, a vessel that had, on its own, been enough to bring entire worlds to their knees in past conquests. Admiral, their flagship is moving to engage directly, Chen reported, a note of tension entering her voice, as the sensors picked up the massive vessel's approach. Its weapons output is far beyond anything we've seen so far in this battle. Voss studied the image of the alien flagship on his display. It was enormous, easily 3 times the size of the Endurance, bristling with weapons and defenses that made his own flagship look small by comparison. That's their command ship, Voss said. If Vrix Thalor is aboard, and I'd bet everything that he is, then that ship is the heart of their entire fleet. Cut off the head, and the rest may lose their coordination. Are you suggesting we engage it directly, Admiral? Chen asked. Our simulations always assumed we would avoid direct confrontation with their flagship until later in the battle. Plans change once the shooting starts, Captain, Voss said, but we won't be foolish about it. Signal the 2nd and 3rd fleets. I want a coordinated strike on that flagship, using everything we've got. No single ship engages it alone. We hit it together, or we don't hit it at all. The order went out across the human fleet, and slowly, dozens of ships began to converge on the position of the Devourer of Stars, forming a loose but coordinated formation of their own, designed to bring overwhelming firepower to bear on the single most dangerous vessel in the battle. Aboard the Falcon 7. Marcus Webb received the order to redirect toward the coordinated strike on the enemy flagship and felt his stomach tighten with a mixture of fear and excitement. "You hear that, Priya? We're going after the big one." "I heard," Priya said, her voice steady, despite the obvious danger of the order. "Guess this is what 30 years of training was for." Together, their small squadron of fighters banked hard and began accelerating toward the position of the Devourer of Stars. Joining the growing wave of human ships converging on the massive alien vessel from every direction. Behind them, the rest of the battle raged on, ships firing and maneuvering in the vast dark of space, explosions blooming silently against the black backdrop of stars, debris from destroyed vessels drifting slowly outward in every direction. On the bridge of the Devourer of Stars, Grand Marshal Vrix Thalor watched the human ships converging on his position, and for the first time since the battle began, felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not fear exactly, but a kind of grim respect for an enemy that fought with far more skill and coordination than he had ever expected from a species he had judged as primitive and weak. "They fight like a single mind, spread across 1,000 ships," Vrix murmured, almost to himself. "Grand Marshal?" Sarek asked, not quite understanding. "Nothing," Vrix said, straightening in his command chair. "Bring all weapons to bear on the incoming human ships. We will show them why the Dominion has never lost a war." The Devourer of Stars opened fire with its full weapons array, sending a storm of energy blasts into the approaching wave of human ships. Several smaller vessels were destroyed instantly, their shields overwhelmed by the sheer power of the flagship's weapons, bright flashes of light marking their deaths against the darkness of space. But the human ships did not break formation. They pressed forward, firing back with everything they had, their combined weapons fire beginning to chip away at the flagship's powerful shields. The battle for the fate of Earth had truly begun, and neither side, in that moment, could say for certain how it would end. The battle around the Devourer of Stars grew fiercer with every passing minute. Human ships pressed their attack from every angle, their combined weapons fire slowly wearing down the massive flagship's shields, while the Kaltari vessel's own devastating weapons tore through the human formation, destroying ship after ship in bright, silent flashes of light. Aboard the Falcon 7, Marcus Webb pulled his fighter into a tight turn, narrowly avoiding a blast from one of the flagship's smaller point defense weapons, systems designed specifically to shoot down fighters like his own. "They've got defense turrets all over that thing," Marcus said, breathing hard as he weaved through the incoming fire. "It's like flying into a hailstorm." "Focus on the shield generators," Priya reminded him, her voice tight with concentration, as she flew close beside him. "Command said if we can knock those out, it'll open the flagship up to the bigger ship's weapons." Marcus nodded, even though she couldn't see him. He angled his fighter toward one of the visible shield generator nodes on the flagship's hull, a glowing blue structure, roughly the size of a small building, protected by its own ring of defense turrets. It was a dangerous target, heavily defended, but Marcus had trained for exactly this kind of precision strike since he was old enough to sit in a fighter simulator. "On your mark," Priya said. "Now." Marcus called, and both fighters dove together, weaving between defensive fire, releasing a coordinated volley of missiles at the shield generator node. The alien defenses fired back desperately, and a missile from Priya's ship exploded early, destroyed before it could reach its target. But two of Marcus's missiles slipped through the chaos and struck the generator dead on, and a bright, silent explosion bloomed against the flagship's hull. "Direct hit," Marcus shouted. "Shield generator is down." On the Endurance, Admiral Voss watched the tactical display as a small section of the Devourer of Stars shields flickered and went dark, a weak point now visible in the previously impenetrable defense. "Concentrate all fire on that section of their shields," Voss ordered immediately. "Every ship in range, now." The human fleet responded instantly, dozens of vessels redirecting their weapons fire toward the exposed section of the flagship's hull. The concentrated barrage tore through the weakened shields entirely, and for the first time in the battle, weapons fire began striking the Devourer of Stars. Actual armor plating, sending shudders through the massive ship that could be felt even on its distant bridge. Grand Marshal Vrix Thalor gripped the arms of his command chair as the ship shook violently around him. Damage report. Grand Marshal, we've lost shield coverage across our forward starboard section, Sarek reported, his voice strained. Hull integrity in that area is at 60% and falling. They found a weakness in our shield generators and exploited it perfectly. Vrix's amber eyes flashed with something between anger and grudging respect. They are learning our weaknesses faster than we are learning theirs. Redirect auxiliary power to reinforce that section immediately, and launch the second wave of fighters. I want those human strike craft cleared from our hull before they can find another weak point. As Kaltari fighters began pouring out from launch bays across the flagship, the battle around the Devourer of Stars grew even more chaotic. Marcus and Priya found themselves suddenly facing a swarm of enemy fighters, sleek dark ships that moved with brutal, aggressive speed. Marcus, we've got company, Priya called out as 3 Kaltari fighters broke off from the main swarm and turned directly toward their position. I see them. Break formation, draw them apart. The 2 human fighters split in different directions, forcing the pursuing Kaltari fighters to choose between them. 2 of the enemy fighters followed Marcus, while the 3rd pursued Priya alone. Marcus gritted his teeth and pulled his fighter into a series of sharp, unpredictable turns, trying to shake his pursuers long enough to bring his own weapons to bear. Come on, he muttered to himself, watching his rear sensor display as the 2 enemy fighters closed the distance behind him. Just a little closer. At the last possible moment, Marcus cut his engines and fired his maneuvering thrusters hard, flipping his fighter almost completely around in space, while his forward momentum carried him backward along his original path. It was a maneuver only possible in the vacuum of space, where there was no air resistance to fight against, and it was a maneuver he had practiced thousands of times in simulation but never once in real combat. For a brief, terrifying moment, his fighter faced directly toward the 2 pursuing Kaltari ships, weapons ready, while they were still adjusting to his sudden change in direction. He fired, and both shots struck true. One Kaltari fighter's shields collapsed entirely, and it spun off, disabled. The second exploded outright, destroyed by the concentrated blast. Nice shot, Priya called over the comm, having dispatched her own pursuer with a more conventional attack run. Where did you learn that move? Simulator 17, Marcus said, breathing hard with relief and adrenaline. Never thought I'd actually get to use it. Elsewhere, across the vast battlefield, the tide of the fight continued to shift back and forth, neither side gaining a clear advantage for long, before the other found some new tactic or weakness to exploit. On the bridge of the Hammond, Captain Elena Reyes watched her tactical display with growing concern, as 3 Kaltari capital ships regrouped and began advancing on her cruiser's position, their weapons fully recharged after the earlier exchange. They're coming back for us, Reyes said grimly. Helm, evasive pattern Delta, gunners, target their lead ship's engines. If we can slow them down, we can buy time for reinforcements. The Hammond twisted through space, its gunners firing precise, targeted shots at the engines of the lead Kaltari vessel, while the ship itself weaved unpredictably to avoid the worst of the incoming fire. It was a desperate, difficult maneuver, requiring perfect coordination between the ship's pilot and its weapons crews, but it was exactly the kind of tactic that decades of Project Vigil training had prepared them for. Slowly, the concentrated fire on the lead Kaltari ship's engines began to take effect, and its speed dropped noticeably, falling out of formation with the other 2 vessels. Their lead ship is falling behind. The Hammond, Zest tactical officer called out. Engines damaged. They can't keep pace with the others. Then let's make sure they can't catch up at all, Reyes said. Full spread. Everything we've got. Target that ship's weakened engine section. The Hammond unleashed a full volley of its remaining weapons at the crippled Kaltari vessel, and the combined damage finally proved too much for the ship's already weakened systems. A series of explosions rippled along its hull, and moments later, The vessel broke apart entirely, debris scattering silently into the dark. "One down," Reyes said quietly, allowing herself only a brief moment of relief before turning her attention to the remaining 2 Kaltari ships, still bearing down on her position. Now for the other 2. Back on the Devourer of Stars. Grand Marshal Vrix Thaler received report after report of losses across his fleet, each one more troubling than the last. Ships destroyed, formations broken, human vessels fighting with a level of coordination and tactical skill that no intelligence report had ever suggested this species possessed. "Grand Marshal, we have lost 43 ships," Sarek reported, his voice heavy with the weight of the number. "The humans have lost 61, but our fleet was never designed to sustain losses at this rate against a supposedly primitive enemy. If this continues, we may face difficulty maintaining fleet cohesion." Vrix Thaler was silent for a long moment, staring at the tactical display before him, watching the chaotic dance of ships across the battlefield. He thought of the intelligence reports he had reviewed before setting out for this system. Reports that spoke of a species still fighting wars with simple explosives and crude vehicles. A species with no space combat capability worth mentioning. Those reports had been catastrophically wrong, and now his ships were paying the price for that error. "We underestimated them," Vrix said finally, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the bridge. "This was no accident of fate. They knew we were coming. They prepared for decades, perhaps longer, hiding an entire fleet from our observation, while we watched only their old, outdated signals and assumed nothing had changed." "What are your orders, Grand Marshal?" Sarek asked. Vrix considered the question carefully. He was a proud warrior, and the thought of retreating from a fight, especially against a species he had judged so far beneath the Dominion, was almost unbearable to him. But he was also an experienced commander, and he knew that pride which ignored reality was the surest path to disaster. "We will not retreat," Vrix said finally. "Not yet, but we will change our approach. Order all remaining ships to consolidate into a tighter defensive formation around the Devourer of Stars. We will stop trying to overwhelm them with spread-out attacks, and instead focus our combined strength on breaking through their center, directly toward their own flagship. If we can destroy their command vessel, their coordination may collapse, just as ours nearly has." The order went out, and slowly, the scattered Kaltari ships began to pull together into a tighter, more concentrated formation, abandoning their earlier attempt to overwhelm the humans from multiple directions in favor of a single, focused push directly toward the heart of the human fleet. On the Endurance. Admiral Voss watched this shift in enemy tactics with a grim expression. "They're consolidating," he said. "Looks like they're planning a direct strike at our position. Should we retreat the Endurance to a safer position, Admiral?" Chen asked. Voss shook his head firmly. "No. If we pull back now, it tells them we're afraid, and it opens gaps in our own formation that they can exploit. We hold our ground, signal the rest of the fleet. If they want to come straight at us, we'll make sure they regret it." Across the vast, chaotic battlefield, both fleets began to shift and reposition, the Kaltari consolidating for one final, decisive push, and the humans preparing to meet that push with everything they had built over decades of secret preparation. Far below, unseen and unaware, the people of Earth continued their daily lives, still not knowing that the fate of their entire world was being decided, in the cold dark beyond the orbit of Neptune, in a battle that was only now approaching its most dangerous and decisive phase. The Kaltari fleet moved as one now, a tight wall of warships pushing directly toward the center of the human formation, where the Endurance held its position surrounded by its escort ships. Grand Marshal Vrix Thaler had committed to his final strategy, and every remaining Kaltari vessel, battered but still dangerous, poured its full power into the advance. "Admiral, their entire remaining fleet is converging on our position," Chen reported, her voice tight with tension, as she watched the tactical display fill with red markers moving steadily closer to the center. 211 ships, moving in a tight formation, weapons fully charged. Voss studied the display for a long moment. 211 ships remained of the original 300, still a formidable force, still more than capable of destroying the Endurance. and everything around it if allowed to strike unopposed. But the human fleet had also taken losses, and now numbered 340 ships, spread thin across the vast battlefield, many of them damaged from hours of continuous fighting. "They're gambling everything on breaking our center," Voss said. "If they get through to us, and destroy the Endurance. They're hoping the rest of our fleet loses coordination, just like theirs nearly did. Should we pull the Endurance back, Admiral?" Chen asked again, more urgently this time. Voss shook his head. "No. If I run now, it proves their theory right, that killing the flagship breaks our coordination. We're not going to give them that satisfaction. Signal all fleet elements. Converge on our position, but maintain formation integrity. We're going to meet their charge head-on, and we're going to break it." The order spread across the human fleet, and ships from every corner of the battlefield began turning back toward the center, moving to reinforce the position around the Endurance, forming a defensive wall against the incoming Kaltari advance. Aboard the Falcon 7. Marcus Webb received the recall order along with the rest of his squadron, and turned his fighter back toward the center of the battle, joining a growing river of human ships, all converging on the same point. "This is it," Priya said quietly over the comm, flying close beside him. "Whatever happens in the next few minutes decides everything." "Yeah," Marcus said, feeling a strange calm settle over him, despite the danger ahead. "Let's make sure it goes our way." As the two fleets closed the distance between them, the space around the Endurance filled with an almost unbearable tension, both sides preparing for what everyone involved understood would be the decisive moment of the entire battle. Grand Marshal Vrix Thalor stood at the center of his bridge, watching the human fleet gathering to meet his advance, and felt a strange mixture of pride and dread. "They are not running," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Even now, facing our full remaining strength, they hold their ground and come to meet us directly." "Grand Marshal, should we adjust our approach?" Sarek asked, noticing the note of hesitation in his commander's voice. Vrix shook his head slowly. "No, we have committed. There is no strategy left but to press forward and hope our strength is enough. All ships, maximum weapons power, full speed ahead, for the glory of the Dominion." The two fleets met in the middle of the battlefield, in a collision of fire and steel, unlike anything either species had experienced before. Weapons fire crossed the gap between the fleets in a storm of energy, ships on both sides taking devastating hits as the formations crashed together. The Endurance itself came under heavy fire almost immediately, its shields flaring bright as multiple Kaltari vessels focused their weapons on the human flagship. "Shields at 60% and dropping fast," Chen called out, gripping her console as the ship shuddered under the impact of repeated hits. "Hold position," Voss said, his voice remaining steady, despite the chaos around him. "Order the 3rd and 7th Squadrons to intercept the ships, targeting us directly." Nearby, dozens of smaller human vessels broke away from the main formation to intercept the Kaltari ships, focusing their fire on the Endurance, drawing enemy attention away from the flagship and absorbing hits meant for it, sacrificing themselves in some cases to protect the ship that represented the coordination point for the entire human fleet. Marcus and Priya found themselves in the thick of this desperate defense, weaving between larger warships, firing at Kaltari vessels that threatened to break through toward the Endurance. There, that cruiser lining up a shot on the day they invaded Earth. Marcus called out, spotting a Kaltari vessel maneuvering into firing position against the human flagship's weakened side. "I see it, let's take it down." The two fighters dove together, weaving through defensive fire, and unleashed everything they had at the Kaltari cruiser's weapons systems. It was a desperate, dangerous attack run, but it worked, and the cruiser's weapons array went dark just before it could fire on the Endurance, buying the flagship precious seconds of relief. Elsewhere in the battle, Captain Elena Reyes and the crew of the Hammond fought their own desperate engagement, having pushed through heavy resistance to reach the center of the fighting in time to reinforce the defense around the flagship. "Admiral, this is Reyes. We're moving into position to support the Endurance." Z's starboard flank, she reported over the comm, her voice tense but steady, despite the chaos visible through her ship's viewport. Understood, Captain. We appreciate the support, Voss replied. Their center is weakening. If we can hold just a little longer, I think we can break their advance entirely. He was right. Slowly, painfully, the concentrated defense around the Endurance began to turn the tide of the engagement. The Kaltari's desperate final push, while powerful, had also concentrated their remaining ships into a single vulnerable formation, one that the human fleet, now fully converged and coordinated, could bring overwhelming firepower to bear against. On the bridge of the Devourer of Stars, Grand Marshal Vrix Thalor watched with growing alarm as ship after ship in his formation was destroyed or disabled, the human defense proving far stronger and more coordinated than he had anticipated, even after hours of hard-won respect for their tactical abilities. Grand Marshal, we have lost over half our remaining fleet, Sarek reported, his voice barely above a whisper. If we continue this engagement, we risk losing everything. Vrix Thalor closed his eyes for a brief moment, the weight of the decision before him heavier than any he had faced in his long career. To retreat now would mean admitting defeat, something the Dominion had never done in living memory, but to continue would mean the total destruction of his fleet, and the deaths of every warrior still serving under his command. Grand Marshal, Sarek said again, more urgently this time, the humans have opened a direct path toward our flagship. Several of their vessels are breaking through our escort screen and moving to engage us directly. Vrix opened his eyes and looked at the tactical display, seeing exactly what Sarek described. Human ships, having broken the back of the Kaltari's desperate charge, were now pressing their advantage, moving to finish what they had started hours ago in the cold dark beyond Neptune. All remaining ships, Vrix said, his voice heavy but clear, concentrate defensive fire around the Devourer of Stars. Do not let them board us. If this ship falls, the fleet falls with it. The remaining Kaltari ships, fewer than 100 now, pulled together in a final desperate ring around their flagship, trying to hold off the advancing human vessels long enough to find some way out of the disaster that had befallen them. But the human fleet, sensing victory within reach after hours of brutal fighting, pressed their attack with renewed intensity. Admiral, their flagship shields are failing, Chen reported, excitement and exhaustion mixing in her voice in equal measure. If we concentrate fire now, we could break through entirely. Voss studied the display for a long moment, weighing the cost of a final decisive strike against the risk of prolonging the battle further, risking more human lives with every passing minute. Signal all ships, Voss said finally. Concentrate everything we have on their flagship's shields. Let's end this. Every remaining human vessel within range turned its weapons toward the Devourer of Stars, unleashing a combined barrage of firepower that no single ship's shields, no matter how powerful, could hope to withstand indefinitely. The alien flagship's defenses flared bright, held for several long seconds under the tremendous assault, and then, finally, collapsed entirely, leaving the massive vessel's hull exposed to the full fury of humanity's combined fleet. On the bridge of the Devourer of Stars, alarms blared throughout the ship as the shields failed completely, and Grand Marshal Vrix Thalor felt the vessel shudder violently around him, as weapons fire began striking the flagship's actual hull, for the first time in the entire battle. Grand Marshal, hull breaches on multiple decks, Sarek shouted over the chaos of the bridge. We cannot withstand this level of sustained fire much longer. Vrix Thalor looked around his bridge, at the officers and warriors who had served under him through 6 previous conquests, now facing the reality of a battle they were losing, against an enemy they had judged, catastrophically, to be weak and primitive. He thought of the pride that had led him here, the certainty that Earth would fall easily just as every other world had fallen before it. That certainty now lay in ruins around him, along with the greater part of his once mighty fleet. He made his decision. All ships, Vrix said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to order. Cease your advance. Signal a full retreat. We are leaving this system. The order, once given, could not be unheard, and across the remaining Kaltari fleet, ships began breaking off their attacks, turning away from the battle, and beginning to retreat back toward the edge of the solar system, away from the humans who had proven themselves far more dangerous than anyone in the Dominion had ever imagined possible. On the Endurance. Admiral Voss watched the retreat begin with a mixture of relief and lingering caution. "Admiral, they're pulling back," Chen reported. "Their entire remaining fleet, breaking off and retreating. Do not pursue them beyond the edge of the system," Voss ordered immediately. "Let them go. We've proven what we needed to prove today. There's no need to chase them further and risk more lives than necessary." As the remaining Kaltari ships fled toward the darkness beyond Neptune, Grand Marshal Vrix Thalor stood on the bridge of his battered flagship, watching Earth's defenders hold their position rather than pursue his retreating fleet, and felt something he had not expected to feel toward the species he had come here to conquer. Respect, mixed uneasily with the bitter taste of an unprecedented defeat. The battle was over, but the silence that followed felt strange and heavy to everyone who had survived it. Across the vast expanse of the Kuiper Belt, the wreckage of hundreds of ships drifted slowly through the dark, human and Kaltari debris mixed together in a field of twisted metal that would remain there, frozen and unchanging, for centuries to come. Admiral James Voss sat quietly in his command chair aboard the Endurance, watching the final reports come in from across his fleet, and allowed himself, for the first time in many hours, to breathe a little easier. "Final count, Admiral," Captain Chen said, her voice tired but steady. "We lost 138 ships. The Kaltari lost 234 out of their original 300. Their remaining 66 vessels are continuing their retreat beyond the edge of the system." Voss nodded slowly, absorbing the numbers. 138 ships meant thousands of lives lost, men and women who had trained their entire lives for this single battle, and would never see the world they had died protecting. It was a heavy cost, but it was a cost that had bought something priceless. Earth remained free, unconquered, and safe from the immediate threat that had loomed over it for 60 years. "Get me a channel to Earth," Voss said quietly. "It's time they knew what happened out here." A few minutes later, on the other side of the solar system, in a secure communications room deep beneath the Colorado mountains, a small group of world leaders and Project Vigil officials gathered to receive the transmission they had been waiting decades to hear. The message that came through was simple, but it carried the weight of an entire species' survival. "This is Admiral James Voss of the Sol Defense Fleet," the recording began. "The Kaltari invasion fleet has been repelled. Earth is safe. We suffered losses, but the enemy has retreated beyond our system, and I do not believe they will return anytime soon, not after what they witnessed here today." In that small room, deep beneath the mountains, there was a long moment of silence before anyone spoke. Decades of secret work, decades of fear and preparation, carried quietly by a small circle of people who understood the stakes, while the rest of humanity lived on, unaware, had finally come to an end. Earth had won. "It's time to tell the world," said the Secretary General of the newly formed Earth Defense Council, an older woman named Adaize Okafor, who had inherited leadership of Project Vigil only 2 years earlier from her predecessor. They deserved to know what almost happened, and what was done to stop it. Over the following days, the truth of what had happened far beyond Neptune slowly spread across the entire world. It began with careful, measured announcements from world governments, explaining that an alien fleet had approached the solar system with hostile intentions, and that a defense fleet, built in secret over the course of decades, had successfully repelled the invasion. The initial reaction across the globe was a mixture of shock, fear, and disbelief. Many people struggled to accept that their governments had kept such an enormous secret for so long, building an entire fleet of warships without the knowledge of the very people it was meant to protect. But as more details emerged, as footage from the battle was slowly released to the public, and as survivors like Marcus Webb and Priya Anand began sharing their stories, the initial shock gave way to something else. A deep and profound sense of gratitude and pride in what humanity had managed to accomplish together, setting aside old rivalries and old conflicts to build something that had saved their entire species from conquest. Marcus Webb found himself, in the weeks following the battle, standing before a large crowd gathered in what had once been a quiet town square, now filled with people, eager to hear directly from one of the pilots who had fought in the historic battle. He felt strange, standing there in his flight uniform, facing so many people who, only weeks earlier, Had no idea that people like him even existed. I grew up on the far side of the moon, Marcus told the crowd, his voice carrying clearly through the speakers set up around the square. I never lived on Earth. I trained my whole life for a battle I wasn't even sure would ever come. But when it did come, I understood exactly why all those years of training mattered. We weren't just fighting for ourselves out there. We were fighting for every single person down here. Everyone living their normal life, going about their day, never knowing how close we came to losing everything. A woman near the front of the crowd raised her hand, and when Marcus nodded to her, she asked, "Do you think they'll come back?" "The Kaltari?" Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know for certain, but I know this. They came here expecting an easy conquest, and they found out the hard way that Earth is not an easy target. I think that lesson will stay with them for a long time. And even if they do come back, we'll be ready. We're always going to be ready, from now on." Far beyond the edge of the solar system, aboard the battered remains of the Devourer of Stars, Grand Marshal Vrix Thalor sat alone in his private quarters, reflecting on the disaster that had befallen his fleet. Of the 300 ships he had brought to conquer Earth, only 66 remained, limping home to report the first true defeat the Kaltari Dominion had suffered in generations. Sarek entered quietly, standing at a respectful distance until Vrix acknowledged him. "Grand Marshal, the High Council has requested a full report on what happened. They will want to understand how a fleet judged so primitive managed to defeat us so thoroughly." Vrix was silent for a long moment before answering. "Tell them the truth, Sarek. Tell them we underestimated an enemy, because we judged them by old signals and outdated information, and paid for that mistake with the greatest defeat in our history. Tell them that Earth is not primitive. Earth is patient, and clever, and willing to work in silence for generations, if it means protecting what they value. Tell them, if the Dominion ever considers returning to that system, they should send scouts first, and study their enemy properly this time, rather than assuming an old broadcast tells the whole story of a species." "Do you believe they will attempt another invasion, Grand Marshal?" Sarek asked. Vrix considered this for a long moment, his amber eyes distant as he thought back on the battle, on the coordination and skill the human fleet had shown, on the strange, unbreakable resolve of an enemy who refused to abandon their flagship even when facing what should have been overwhelming odds. "Perhaps, eventually, the Council will decide the prize is worth another attempt," Vrix said finally, "but I do not believe it will happen soon. And if it does happen, I suspect it will require far greater strength than what we brought this time. Earth has shown the galaxy that it will not be conquered easily. That is a lesson not soon forgotten, by us or by anyone else who might have been watching." Back on Earth, in the months that followed the battle, humanity began a new chapter in its history. The secret of Project Vigil, once hidden from the world for decades, became instead a symbol of what humanity could accomplish when it set aside its differences and worked toward a common purpose. The Sol Defense Fleet, no longer hidden, became a proud and open institution, with new recruits from every nation on Earth eager to join the ranks of those who had saved their world. Admiral Voss stood on the observation deck of a newly constructed space station, orbiting high above Earth, watching the blue planet turn slowly below him. Beside him stood Marcus Webb, now promoted to captain after his actions in the battle, and Elena Reyes, whose skillful command of the Hammond had earned her a place among the fleet's most respected officers. "It's strange," Marcus said, looking down at the planet he had defended but never actually lived on. "All my life, I trained to protect a world I'd never even seen with my own eyes. Now I finally get to look at it properly. It's beautiful, isn't it?" Reyes said quietly. "It is," Marcus agreed. "Worth everything we went through out there." Voss nodded, watching the same planet, thinking of his father, and of all the others who had given their lives, in ways large and small, to build the fleet that had ultimately saved humanity from conquest. "We built something remarkable out there, in secret, over decades," he said. "Not just a fleet of ships, but a promise. A promise that Earth would never be caught helpless, no matter what came from beyond the stars." He turned to look at the two younger officers beside him, both of whom had fought and bled to keep that promise alive. "The Kaltari will remember what happened here, and somewhere out there, other species who might have considered Earth an easy target will hear about this battle too. We've earned ourselves a reputation, whether we wanted one or not. What kind of reputation? Reyes asked. Voss smiled slightly, watching Earth continue its slow, steady turn far below them. The kind that makes anyone thinking of conquering us think twice before trying. And far below, on the surface of the world they had fought to protect, billions of people went about their lives, no longer unaware of the silent guardians who watched over them from the dark beyond the planets, no longer ignorant of the price that had been paid, in secret and in silence, to keep their world free. Earth had faced its first true test from beyond the stars, and Earth had endured, not through luck, but through decades of quiet preparation, and the courage of those willing to fight for a world that had never known it needed saving. The Kaltari fleet had come to conquer Earth, but humans had been waiting in space, patient and ready, and in the end, it was Earth's enemies who learned the hardest lesson of all. Never underestimate a species that has learned, through hardship and struggle, exactly how to survive.